He raised his hand with the certainty that no one would challenge him. At that moment, he was untouchable. Li Wei stood in the heart of New York City, the gleaming glass walls of his luxury restaurant reflecting his power. His sharp suit, tailored to perfection, seemed to absorb the light just like his presence in every room he entered. As a billionaire CEO, he had spent years building an empire. His wealth was a fortress, his influence unshakable. At 52, Li Wei was the kind of man whose name carried weight before he even entered a room. People moved out of his way, not out of respect, but because they knew what his position demanded. The restaurant was his crown jewel, blend of tradition and modern luxury, where the finest foods in the world were served in the most refined atmosphere. The scent of rich spices and fine wines hung in the air, adding to the sense of exclusivity. But Li Wei didn't come here for the food. He came for the recognition. Tonight, as always, he would be the center of attention. His hands, powerful yet controlled, guided the glass of wine to his lips as he surveyed the room. His eyes passed over the patrons, effortlessly noting who was worthy of his time. It wasn't arrogance, it was his right. He had earned it. But then something unusual caught his eye. The tension in the air thickened, a storm gathering just before the first strike. Li Wei's patience, worn thin by the evening's endless delays, was fraying. His hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale, eyes fixed on Tiffany as she approached. He had never been known for his kindness. His wealth and status had granted him the power to demand, to expect. And yet something about tonight, something about her, was pushing him to the edge. "Is everything all right with your order, sir?" Tiffany asked, her voice cool but polite, though there was a slight edge of hesitation in it. Li Wei leaned back in his chair, his gaze hardening. His eyes tracked her every movement, as if she were an obstacle in the way of his evening's perfection. She had taken too long to bring his drink, too long to respond to his request. His lip twitched, a flash of irritation igniting inside him. To him, this was more than a simple delay. It was an insult. "You've kept me waiting long enough," he snapped, his voice sharp, colder than the icy edge of the glass in his hand. "I am not a man who is accustomed to delays." Tiffany's eyes flickered with a mix of professionalism and restraint. She had seen this kind of entitlement before, but rarely did it come from someone who commanded such a space, such power. Still, she fought to keep her voice steady. "I'm sorry for the delay, sir. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." The words, as measured as they were, did nothing to calm Li Wei's rising anger. The room, despite its wealth and warmth, seemed to narrow around them. Every whisper from the other diners, every clink of glass seemed to fade as he focused on Tiffany. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't apologizing the way he expected. "You think your little apology is enough?" he hissed, standing suddenly, his chair scraping sharply against the floor. His eyes burned, and in that moment Tiffany saw not the man in control of an empire, but the man consumed by a raw, primal rage. He slammed his hand onto the table. The force rattled the silverware, the glass wobbling dangerously at the edge. The air itself seemed to shudder with the impact. A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Tiffany froze, her heart racing. She hadn't expected this. A moment ago they were exchanging polite words. Now it was as though the world had shifted. The balance tipped toward something darker, something much more dangerous. For a split second, everything stood still. Li Wei's face twisted, his breath shallow, and his hand hovered dangerously close to Tiffany. But he stopped. His fingers, curled tightly, hung in the air for just a moment longer than necessary. The fear was palpable. The anger, too. But the tension, the tension was suffocating. Tiffany didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on his, her stance unbroken, though her mind was screaming. She hadn't been afraid of him before, but now there was a cold, unmistakable edge to his presence. The moment passed. Li Wei, still seething, lowered his hand and stepped back, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. Tiffany, though shaken, stood motionless. The silence hung between them like a thick fog. Her breath came in short, controlled bursts, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something else that kept her from responding in kind. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the moment. Maybe it was the realization that no apology would ever bridge the gap between them. Li Wei, however, stood tall once again, his chest rising and falling with barely contained anger. He looked around the room, meeting the gazes of those who had witnessed the exchange. But his pride wouldn't let him acknowledge the moment for what it truly was. He was still the man who controlled everything here. Tiffany could see it in his eyes. He thought the moment was over. He thought it would be forgotten. He believed his power was enough to erase any trace of what had just occurred. But Tiffany knew. She knew that this was just the beginning. Her heart still pounded in her chest, but there was something else. A quiet, simmering strength that she had never fully acknowledged before. It steadied her, even as her hands shook slightly beneath her apron. Li Wei may have won this moment, but something within her had shifted. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew she was no longer just the waitress in the corner. Not anymore. As the moment passed and the room returned to its rhythm, Tiffany's thoughts lingered on one thing. Justice doesn't bend. The storm had only just begun. Across the room, Tiffany moved with a quiet confidence. She wasn't one of the restaurant's high-profile guests or the well-known socialites Li Wei was used to seeing. She was a waitress, but there was something in the way she carried herself that made Li Wei's gaze linger longer than he intended. Her dark eyes met his briefly, then quickly shifted away as she moved to another table, her posture firm yet unflinching. It was a minor moment, hardly worth mentioning, yet for Li Wei it was the first crack in his perfect world. No one ever looked him in the eye for long. No one stood their ground like that. As the evening wore on, his thoughts kept returning to Tiffany. She was different. There was an energy about her, something more than just a waitress. He couldn't place it, but it unnerved him. For a moment, it was as though the walls of his empire had shifted, if only slightly. A few minutes later, it was her turn to serve him. She approached his table, her eyes downcast as she placed the menu in front of him. Her movements were quick, deliberate, but there was no trembling, no submission in her stance. Li Wei couldn't help but notice the subtle defiance in her posture. It was as if she knew who he was and it didn't matter. Tiffany asked if everything was to his liking, but her voice, though polite, lacked the reverence he was accustomed to. Something in her tone flickered just for an instant, a challenge, quiet but clear. The words hung in the air like a spark just before a flame. Li Wei's eyes narrowed slightly, a fleeting moment of annoyance crossing his face. In the silence that followed, his hand, resting on the table, clenched. His grip tightened on the stem of his wine glass, the glass wobbling slightly. He could feel the heat rise in his chest, and for a moment he didn't control it. The sharpness of his thoughts, how dare she, was followed by the pull of his temper. A spark of rage flickering into something darker. He raised his hand, his fingers curling slightly. A flash of anger crossed his face. The room around him seemed to quiet, the music fading into the background. Tiffany was oblivious to the storm forming behind his eyes, focused instead on the task at hand. But Li Wei knew. Something had shifted. He was used to power, to people obeying without question, but Tiffany's quiet resistance, though small, had ignited something within him. Something dangerous. As he stood, his movements were sharp, deliberate. The anger burned beneath the surface, hot and ready. It was a spark, just waiting for the right moment to ignite. Li Wei thought the moment had passed. But what he didn't know was that the truth was already out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to come to light. The restaurant, bathed in golden light and expensive decor, returned to its rhythm after the confrontation. The clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of conversations, it was all back to normal. But somewhere above the chaos, behind the walls, a small camera had captured it all. Tiffany hadn't known. She had walked away, shaken but composed, her heart still racing. The words she'd wanted to say were locked inside her, swallowed by the tension of the moment. She hadn't realized that every movement she made was recorded, every word spoken now immortalized. The CCTV footage, a silent witness, had captured every second. The slight quiver of Tiffany's hand as she placed the menu on Li Wei's table, the tension that sparked in his eyes, the final act when his anger exploded and the glass nearly toppled. It had all been caught by a hidden lens, waiting, recording. The assistant manager, a man named Brian, had witnessed the altercation from a corner of the restaurant. He had seen everything, The flicker of rage in Li Wei's eyes, the force of his outburst, the way Tiffany had stood her ground, unflinching. For a moment, Brian had hesitated. He had seen the power Li Wei wielded, the way the wealthy and powerful could make things disappear. But this time, something gnawed at him. Li Wei may have been untouchable in this world, but in Brian's there was a line, an unspoken rule that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, should cross. When Brian finally approached the security office, his decision was already made. The footage, he realized, was more than just a private record of a conflict. It was evidence. It was proof of what happened in that room. And for the first time, it showed the cracks in the empire Li Wei had carefully built. Brian, after a few quiet moments of deliberation, made the call. He sent the video, anonymously, straight to a whistleblower's site. No names, no faces, just the raw footage of a moment that could not be erased. The world that Li Wei had created, his fortress of wealth, control, and silence, was about to crack open. And as the video made its way through the channels of the internet, it didn't take long before people began to notice. At first it was small, comments on obscure forums, a single tweet, a vague post on Reddit. But as the hours passed, the video spread, and with it, the story of what had happened that night in that pristine restaurant slowly began to unravel. The reaction was swift, and it was sharp. Social media exploded with outrage. Users from across the world shared the video, adding their own commentary, their own disgust. The words abuse of power and racial injustice quickly started trending. It wasn't just a video anymore, it was a symbol of something larger than one man's anger. The CEO's name, once whispered in awe in boardrooms, now echoed with a different tone. The tension in the air grew thick. News outlets picked up the story. People who had never heard of Li Wei now knew him as the man who had raised his hand to a waitress. The power, the status, the wealth, none of it mattered. Li Wei's empire, built on the illusion of untouchability, was crumbling. The attention he once commanded was now a glaring spotlight on his every move, every decision. But as the video went viral, as the world's eyes turned on him, Li Wei was still unaware. He went about his day as usual, blind to the storm that was gathering around him. He had no idea that his anger had set in motion a chain of events that would bring his world crashing down. In the corner of a dark office, a small screen flickered as the footage spread like wildfire. And with it, so did the consequences. The tension in the air wasn't just coming from Li Wei anymore. It was coming from the world, watching, waiting for justice. The viral storm was only just beginning. The world has seen it now. There was no turning back. The video, once a quiet recording in the shadows, had become a storm. It spread across the internet like wildfire, its flames licking at the edges of Li Wei's empire. The clip, raw and unfiltered, captured a moment of vulnerability. The man who had once stood unchallenged was now the center of a global uproar. At first, it was just a few posts, comments from strangers, anonymous voices rising in the digital sea. But as the minutes passed, the video began to take on a life of its own. Activists, influencers, and ordinary people alike began to share it. The video, which had once been seen by only a handful, was now watched by millions. The outrage that followed was immediate, fierce, and unapologetic. Social media was ablaze. Tweets, hashtags, and posts poured in from every direction, condemning Li Wei's actions. Voices that had long been silenced, voices of anger, frustration, and fear, rose together in a collective shout. The injustice of it all was clear to them. A powerful man had raised his hand to a woman doing her job, just because she hadn't bowed low enough, hadn't obeyed the unspoken rules of his world. But it wasn't just the slap. It was the layers beneath it. People saw not just a businessman, but a symbol of an age-old power dynamic, one that had existed for far too long. A wealthy man, untouched by consequence, towering over a working-class woman, the implicit message clear. Know your place. Tiffany was a waitress, yes, but she was also a black woman, and that detail couldn't be ignored. As the footage spread, the focus shifted. The racial undertones became impossible to ignore. The comments piled up. He'd never do that to someone like him. It's not just about respect. It's about power. It was a conversation that had been bubbling beneath the surface of society for years, one that no longer could remain quiet. People saw what they had long known to be true. Power wasn't just about money. It was about privilege, and for Li Wei, that privilege had always meant being untouchable. Meanwhile, in the sterile confines of his office, Li Wei watched the video again and again. The image of his own anger shocked him. He could see it now, the wild, dangerous flash in his eyes. It wasn't just about the delay. It was something more, something deeper. But instead of feeling remorse, he felt the stirrings of something else. Was this the moment when the world would finally wake up and see that he was just like them? Just a man with flaws, just a man who had slipped? His arrogance, however, refused to let him see the full picture. He still couldn't believe it had come to this. He had power. He had money. What were these voices on social media? They were nothing. They couldn't touch him. But the pressure was mounting. Every passing hour his phone rang. Board members, shareholders, lawyers. His world, his kingdom was cracking. The calm, polished facade he had spent years perfecting was crumbling. One mistake, one moment of weakness, and now the entire world was watching. They were waiting for him to fall. His company's stock began to dip, slowly at first, then more sharply. The messages from his board were clear. You need to do something. You need to address this. But even as his empire trembled, Tiffany was receiving something he couldn't understand. Support. From every corner of the internet, from every community, people rallied behind her. She had become a symbol too, a symbol of resilience, of courage in the face of power. She had never wanted this, but now she was a voice, amplified beyond her wildest dreams. Li Wei's stomach churned as the weight of it all began to press down on him. The backlash was real. His wealth, his influence could no longer shield him from the consequences of his actions. The room that had once felt like his domain, the polished marble floors, the floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city, felt cold and distant now. He could no longer hide behind his status. The world had seen him for what he was, and it was demanding answers. Tiffany, on the other hand, had become something more than a waitress. She was no longer just a face in the crowd. She had been heard. As Li Wei sat in the silence of his office, the weight of what he had done settled in. This wasn't just about a single outburst. It was about everything that came before it, everything he had never questioned. His power was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The fall had begun. The moment of truth had arrived. The consequences of Li Wei's actions were no longer confined to whispers in the corridors. They were spilling into the daylight. Tiffany had spent the days after the incident replaying the moment in her mind. The anger, the fear, the weight of what had happened. But she knew she couldn't stay silent. She couldn't let the shame of it all be brushed away like it was nothing. And so she made the call. She filed a formal complaint against Li Wei for harassment and assault. The legal process began to move forward, the wheels of justice slowly but surely turning. The lawsuit was filed, and soon the story of that night would no longer be just a video on the internet. It would become part of something much larger. The media's attention shifted, and with it came the harsh scrutiny of the racial undertones that had been simmering beneath the surface all along. The narrative, once focused solely on the CEO's outburst, now deepened. Commentators began to ask the hard questions. What does it say about a man who believes his wealth can protect him from his actions? What does it say when the victim is not only a woman but a black woman in a position of service? The racial divide became clearer with every passing day, and Li Wei, once untouchable, was suddenly painted as the face of a long-standing problem. A man whose wealth and status had allowed him to act without consequence. Till now, meanwhile, Li Wei's empire began to unravel. His company, once celebrated as a symbol of success, was now facing a full-blown public relations disaster. The fallout from the viral video, the lawsuit, and the growing outrage began to chip away at his reputation. The media's focus sharpened, pulling apart every aspect of his public life. The faces that once admired him now looked at him with disgust, and the sponsors, investors, and clients who had once vied for his attention started to distance themselves. In the boardrooms, whispers turned into arguments. Loyal allies who had once stood by him now hesitated, unwilling to risk their own positions. The once solid walls of his empire were crumbling. Li Wei's power had always been a reflection of his control over people, over situations. But now that control was slipping away. The walls he had built were no longer strong enough to protect him. Tiffany, however, found her voice. Her quiet strength became a beacon of hope for others who had suffered in silence. She agreed to an interview, one that would change everything. As the cameras rolled, she spoke with the calm dignity she had shown the night of the incident. But this time, her words were sharp with truth. She didn't just tell her side of the story, she spoke about the systemic issues in the workplace, the quiet racism that existed behind the polished facades of wealth and power. She told the world about the small, daily acts of discrimination that went unnoticed, and how a single moment of anger could reveal the ugliness that so many tried to hide. Her voice, once constrained by fear, was now heard by millions. Li Wei, meanwhile, remained locked in his office, watching the world around him collapse. The emails from his board of directors grew more frequent, the calls more urgent. His lawyers advised him to make a statement, to address the growing firestorm. His name, once spoken with admiration, was now met with disdain. He couldn't hide any longer. The day came when he was forced to step in front of the cameras. The press conference was scheduled. His public apology, however carefully crafted, would be broadcast live for the world to see. Li Wei had never been one to admit fault. His wealth, his power had always shielded him from such things. But now, with the weight of the world on his shoulders, he was left with no choice. As he stood in front of the cameras, his heart pounded in his chest. He spoke the words of regret, words of apology, but they felt hollow. He could feel the eyes of the world on him, judging him. In that moment, he realized the full extent of what he had done. His actions had caused irreparable damage, not just to Tiffany, but to his career, to his legacy. The silence that followed his apology was deafening. For the first time, Li Wei understood that his wealth and power couldn't protect him from the consequences of his own actions. The walls of his empire had come down, and with them, the life he had once known. The world had stopped moving, but inside, Li Wei was still racing. The echo of his outburst still rang in his ears, louder than the quiet of the empty office that surrounded him. He sat alone, his hands resting on the desk before him, eyes unfocused as the weight of his downfall pressed in. The power that had once defined him, the control, the respect, was gone. All that remained was a man alone, stripped of the fortress he'd built around himself for so long. In the silence, memories began to surface, unbidden but relentless. Li Wei's mind wandered back to the early days, before the suits, before the luxury restaurants and billion-dollar deals. He was just a boy, growing up in a small, crowded apartment in Beijing. The son of an ambitious businessman, his childhood was shaped by one clear lesson. To rise, you must never stop climbing. His father, a hard man who demanded excellence, had always made it clear that mediocrity was not an option. Success is the only thing that matters, his father would say, his voice cold and commanding. If you want to be someone, you have to make yourself better than everyone else. No one will hand you anything. It was a message Li Wei had internalized, a belief that had driven him from the smallest of rooms to the highest of towers. He learned to outwork, outsmart, and overpower. And it worked. His rise was swift, his wealth growing at a pace that stunned even the most seasoned investors. He was untouchable, a man whose success was written in the currency of power. But as the years passed, something began to change within him, even as his empire expanded. His belief in his own superiority, once grounded in hard work and sacrifice, became a shield, a wall he could hide behind. His wealth, his position were no longer just symbols of success. They were proof that he was above the rules that governed everyone else. The memories, like flashes of light, flickered through his mind. The people who had flattered him, the sycophants who had kept him on a pedestal, it was all part of the image he had carefully curated. He had built his empire, but it had come with a cost, his humanity. Across town, Tiffany sat in the dimly lit living room of her small apartment. The weight of her own past hung heavy around her, just as the unspoken struggles she faced daily had. Her story was not one of rapid ascent, but of quiet endurance, endurance shaped by the weight of the world's prejudices. Her childhood had been spent in the shadow of constant reminders that the world didn't always see her as equal. As a black woman, Tiffany had been taught from an early age to keep her head down, to smile when she didn't want to speak softly when she needed to be heard. There were no second chances for her, no privilege in the classroom or the workplace. Every success she earned had to be fought for twice as hard, just to prove she deserved it. As she sat on her couch now, replaying the events of the past week, she felt the sting of it all, the slap of Li Wei's anger. Yes, but also the weight of the system that allowed it to happen. It wasn't just one man's outburst. It was the culmination of years of living in a world where she had to work twice as hard to gain half the respect. The incident with Li Wei was a reminder, a brutal slap in the face of what so many like her experienced every day. But it also opened her eyes in ways she hadn't expected. She was tired of shrinking herself, tired of playing by a set of rules that weren't made for people like her. As the days wore on, Tiffany had found her voice, speaking out in ways she never had before. The support she received from the public had been overwhelming. But it wasn't just about the attention. It was about something deeper. She was standing finally on her own terms, and that gave her strength. Li Wei, on the other hand, was left in the aftermath of his actions, grappling with a feeling he had long avoided: humility. He had lived his life thinking that the world owed him respect, that his success was the measure of his worth. But now, with everything lost, the question lingered. What is left of a man who has everything, but no one to share it with? As he sat alone in his office, staring at the empty space around him, a single truth began to settle in. He was no longer untouchable. The privilege he had wielded for so long now felt like a weight, a burden he had failed to see until it was too late. The silence around him was deafening. He realized at last that he could no longer hide behind the walls he had built. The apology he had given was only the beginning. The damage had been done, and it could never be fully undone. In that quiet moment, Li Wei understood something fundamental. His power, his wealth, had never been the answer. It had been a shield. And now, with everything stripped away, he was forced to face the truth. He had to rebuild, not just his career, but himself. But the question remained: how? The intersection of their lives, so briefly crossed by a moment of anger, now lay in the past. Tiffany had found strength in her struggle. Li Wei, on the other hand, stood at the edge of his own awakening, unsure of what the future would hold. He had lost everything that had defined him, and now the road ahead was uncertain. But as the sun set outside his office window, the first flicker of realization began to burn in his chest. He could rebuild, but it would not be on the same terms as before. The journey to redemption had only just begun. The weight of the world had fallen on Li Wei's shoulders, and now there was no escape from the consequences. The once unshakable CEO stood before a packed room, his back rigid, his mind clouded with the reality of his downfall. The interview was set. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and the world waited for him to speak. The same man who had spent years building an empire of wealth, power, and influence was now about to face the truth of his actions. The public had already judged him. His wealth, his status, his title, none of it could shield him now. Every word, every movement felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. The face that had once been admired was now one of shame. The respect he had once commanded gone. The image of the powerful businessman was forever tarnished by a single moment of rage. The man who had believed himself untouchable was now a symbol of everything wrong with the world he had inhabited. As Li Wei sat in front of the cameras, his hands clenched in his lap, he was forced to confront the truth. The privilege he had long taken for granted had allowed him to dismiss the pain of others, to treat people like tools, like objects to be controlled. But now, with the world watching, he was no longer in control. The power he had used to manipulate others was now turned inward, and he had no choice but to face the damage he had caused. In the silence of the interview room, he finally spoke. "I have made a grave mistake," he said, his voice steady but full of the weight of regret. "I acted out of anger. I disrespected a human being, and for that, I am deeply sorry." There was no grand justification, no excuses. Just the raw, unfiltered truth. For the first time, Li Wei acknowledged the reality of his actions. Not just the outburst, but the underlying systems of privilege that had allowed him to live in a bubble, untouched by the struggles of others. He saw now, in his moment of reckoning, how his life had been built on a foundation of inequality. He had never asked himself what it meant to have power over someone. He had never questioned the way he treated others, because he had never had to. Until now. Meanwhile, Tiffany's life was moving in a different direction. The woman who had once been just another waitress in a restaurant now stood at the forefront of a movement. The incident with Li Wei had given her a platform, but more importantly, it had given her a voice. She had turned the pain of that night into something bigger, into a call for justice. As her story spread, support poured in from every corner of the world. People saw her not as a victim, but as a symbol of strength, resilience, and courage. She used her newfound visibility to advocate for racial equality in the workplace, to fight against the system that had allowed Li Wei's behavior to go unchecked for so long. She spoke out for the countless others who had experienced similar injustices, but had no voice to share their stories. On Tiffany's rise was not just about gaining a platform, it was about changing the very system that had kept people like her silent. With each interview, each speech, she became a beacon of hope. Not just for herself, but for others who had been overlooked, oppressed, and ignored. As the world watched these two individuals, their paths, once so separate, began to merge. Li Wei's fall was inescapable, but it had also given Tiffany the chance to rise. In that contrast, there was a profound truth. One man's reckoning had become another woman's revolution. In the quiet aftermath of his public admission, Li Wei sat alone. He had lost everything that had defined him, but in that loss there was clarity. For the first time, he saw the full scope of the harm he had caused and the world he had lived in for so long. It was a world of privilege, of power, of people like him looking the other way while others suffered. But now he couldn't turn away. He couldn't pretend anymore. Li Wei had taken the first step toward redemption, but the journey was far from over. He knew that the road ahead would be long, and that forgiveness could not be earned through words alone. As Tiffany stood before her supporters, she reflected on the lessons she had learned. She had seen how quickly things could change, how easily one's life could be upended by someone else's actions. But she also saw the strength in resilience, the power in standing up, and the importance of using one's voice for change. Her journey, too, had only just begun. And so the story of Li Wei and Tiffany became a story of transformation. Two lives forever altered by a single moment. One man's reckoning, one woman's rise. The world had seen their flaws, but it had also seen their potential for growth. As the interview ended and the cameras shut off, the silence between them was full of weight, the kind that only comes from realizing that change, no matter how hard, is possible. Li Wei stood before the world, a man exposed. The cameras clicked, and the weight of his past hung heavily in the air. The room, once filled with the buzz of power and luxury, now felt cold. The walls, once a symbol of his success, seemed to close in on him. The crowd was silent, waiting. Li Wei's every movement felt like a confession. Each breath a reminder of the journey he had traveled from the heights of his empire to the depths of this moment. This was the reckoning he had spent his life building walls of wealth and status around him, convinced that nothing could touch him. But now, stripped of his title, his pride, and his reputation, he stood alone. There was no one left to protect him. His voice broke the silence, steady but filled with the weight of everything he had lost. "I have wronged many," Li Wei began, his words measured but heavy. "I acted out of anger, out of a sense of superiority that I now realize was wrong. I have treated people, especially those with less power, as though they were beneath me. I have disrespected human dignity in ways I can never take back." The room hung on his every word, the sincerity of his apology undeniable. This was not the CEO of a billion-dollar empire speaking. This was a man stripped bare, confronting the truth of his actions. His wealth, his power, none of it mattered now. He had been forced to face the ugliness of his own privilege. "I apologize to Tiffany," he continued, his gaze faltering as he mentioned her name, "and to everyone I have harmed by my actions. I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for the pain I have caused." In that moment, Something shifted in Li Wei. The pride that had once fueled his every decision was gone, replaced by the quiet humility of a man who had been broken, but who still believed that redemption was possible. This apology was only the beginning. He knew the road ahead would be long, but it was the first step toward something new, a future defined not by his past mistakes, but by his willingness to change. Meanwhile, Tiffany had become something more than a symbol of resistance. She had become a force for change. Her voice, once silenced by the system, now echoed through the halls of corporations, universities, and communities. She used her newfound platform to speak out for workplace diversity, racial justice, and equality for all. Tiffany's rise was not just about her personal triumph. It was about the lives she would change with her words and actions. She was no longer just the woman who had been wronged. She was a leader, an advocate, a voice for those who had been overlooked, ignored, and silenced. Her empowerment came not from the apology of one man, but from her ability to stand tall in the face of adversity. It was in her refusal to let her identity be defined by the actions of others. As she continued her journey, Tiffany found strength in knowing that one moment could change everything. The incident with Li Wei had been the catalyst for something much larger, a movement, a call for justice that would ripple through society. And in the quiet moments, when she stood alone and reflected, Tiffany realized something profound. The world would never be the same. Her story, her strength, had given others the courage to speak out, to demand respect, and to fight for change. The legacy of this story was not one of defeat, but of triumph. Li Wei had lost everything, but in his loss he had found the first steps toward redemption. Tiffany had lost nothing, for in her struggle, she had found everything: her voice, her purpose, and the power to change the world. In the end, it was not just one man's apology or one woman's rise that defined them. It was their shared ability to transform pain into purpose, to turn regret into action. And through it all, they learned the greatest truth of all: justice, dignity, and the power to change a life forever are not defined by the past, but by what we do with it. Li Wei began the long road to redemption. Tiffany, however, stood tall, a symbol of resilience and change. Their journey was far from over, but their stories had already become the legacy of a new beginning.